As we look ahead to the United Nations COP27 meeting next Monday, we're joined by Paul Bledsoe, adjunct professorial lecturer at the Center for Environmental Policy at American University. Thank you for joining us today. It's clear countries are taking steps to reduce emissions, but the UN says the problem is it's not happening quickly enough. Given only a handful of nations have updated their pledges since COP26. So what do you think? Is COP27 a make it or break it conference?
It's extremely important. And the reasons are that while some nations have begun to take new actions, like the United States that passed a $370 billion unprecedented clean energy bill this summer that will reduce U.S. emissions by about 44% over 2005 levels by the end of this decade. Many other nations are not taking action, and their emissions are still growing. The most important of these is China. China's emissions are now almost a third of global emissions and more than the entire developed world combined. And it is time to put pressure on China to cut its emissions, because without that, we cannot reduce overall global emissions. The other key issue that hasn't gotten enough attention is methane. I believe we need a separate global treaty on methane, because cutting methane is the key to reducing near-term temperatures and therefore limiting these extreme weather events and climate change impacts that are hurting economies, public safety, and national security around the world. So there is a lot of work to do.
And what's the biggest hurdle, do you think, for countries to commit to taking actual action? At the end of last year's COP summit, even the language was watered down from phasing out coal to phasing down coal.
That's right. China uses more than half of the world's coal today, and their economy right now is addicted to 20th century type production of subsidized quantities of steel, cement, and other energy intensive products that really aren't needed, but they become addicted to the job creation in heavy industry. China's got to move away from coal and move away from over subsidized heavy industry. Then we also have to begin to subsidize cleaner, renewable, and other forms of energy more thoroughly. I happen to believe that natural gas has got to supplant coal, that phase has got to happen so that coal is essentially eliminated globally within the next 20 years. If we do that, if we bring down the methane emissions dramatically, I talked about, through a separate global treaty on methane, which I'm going to be calling for in Egypt next week, if we do those two things, we can be on the road to avoid catastrophe. If we don't, we are looking at a hothouse planet that will destabilize countries, undermine agriculture, cause mass migration, and undermine economies around the world. This is the leading problem in the world today, and our major nations and politicians have got to start acting like it.
Your earnestness very clear, Professor. There are still unmet promises from previous conferences, particularly when it comes to the dollars and cents. Poor nations are disproportionately affected by climate change, and the conversation around who pays for the damage is continuing. How likely is it that developing countries' demands for compensation will be heard?
So the issue is essentially climate reparations, that the major emitting countries, typically in the north, have created the problem, and poorer countries, often in the south, are now suffering from it. I happen to believe the way through here is probably for large debt reduction to developing countries in exchange for them moving as quickly as they can to clean energy. But it will also take huge investments by the private sector. So the major countries have to incentivize investments not just by governments, but by the private sector, because ultimately it's private sector investment in clean energy that is really going to tip the scales and reduce emissions quickly. For example, in the United States bill that just became law, there are $370 billion of U.S. government incentives and funding, but that is expected to attract trillions of dollars of private sector investment. So we need the private sector to begin to make very large commitments for investments in clean energy and climate resilience and adaptation in the developing world. I think that the major banks around the world have, and financial institutions have, a large responsibility.
Small nations and even developing nations aren't going to move the needle when it comes to meaningful cuts to emissions. It falls to the large nations like the US and China. Where is the sort of roadblocks? Is there political will in some instances?
That's absolutely right. That's a good point, Steve. More than 80% of global emissions are from 20 countries. And as I said, China alone is about a third of emissions. Unfortunately, under President Xi, China has withdrawn from bilateral negotiations with the United States on climate change, which doesn't make any sense. I believe that all nations in Egypt next week need to call on China to re-engage with not just the United States, but with the global community. You know, we are headed toward a climate change Cold War with autocracies like China siding with Russia to get low-cost oil and gas. Other countries are doing that as well, including the Saudi Arabia, Turkey, to some extent India. The autocracies around the world need to be held to account for their increasing emissions, because the EU, Australia, Canada, Japan, and the United States, the major democracies, are beginning to take action. And so I think we need to call attention to the fact that dictatorships are dictating our climate.
Professor, thank you so much, and all the best to you in Egypt next week. That was Paul Bledsoe, adjunct professorial lecturer at the Center for Environmental Policy at American University.